Welcome to the Teachers on Fire podcast, where I profile agents of growth and transformation in education today. Each guest shares their highs, their lows, their passions, their goals, and the resources that are shaping their thinking and inspiring their practice. For show notes and links from each episode, visit teachersonfire.net. You can also follow the show at Teachers on Fire on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, please subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm your host, Tim Cavey. Let's meet today's guest. Today, I'm speaking with Caitlyn Krause. Caitlyn is a learning and design specialist, education leader, keynote speaker, and an authority on VR, AR, and AI. She is also the author of Mindful by Design, a practical guide for cultivating aware, advancing, and authentic learning experiences. You can follow Caitlyn on Twitter at mindwise_CK, on Instagram at the same handle, mindwise_CK, and visit her website at CaitlynKrause.com. Caitlyn, welcome to 2020, and thanks so much for coming on the show today. Are you ready to talk education?
Thank you very much, Tim. I am so ready to talk. I am pumped up, full of energy, and it's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I have to say, you are right in a space that I sort of regard with a lot of interest. I feel like from a distance, I mean, just scrolling through your Twitter feed, I feel like I am out of my depth right now, but I look forward to learning from you. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about your current context in education? What does that look like for you on a daily basis?
Sure. Well, I'd say for me, first off, I love being out of my element. So if my Twitter feed inspires any curiosity, that's kind of my modus. I just go into spaces sometimes, with a pure purpose to discover. And I would say that that's a theme for my days. Curiosity, discovery. Each day tends to be different because after over 10 years serving as a full-time teacher, I ended up founding my own company. So I made a move into education after working as a programmer in Washington, D.C., and I worked with front-end and back-end code. And I remember back in the day, I was really thinking, okay, we exist in boxes sometimes, like quite literally. My first job was in a cubicle, but I felt like my brain was thinking, this is not how I learn. I learn through creating connections. And to me, creativity is all about literally thinking outside the box and creating bridges between two things that are known and seeing a relationship and saying, oh, what could I create from that known that's something new and independent? So a lot of my work is practical, but it has that philosophical underpinning of really kind of pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human in this creative day and age when we have so much tech at our fingertips. It can be overwhelming. So I like to put it into context and work on the storytelling, the voice underneath, and also how to engage people across all ages and say, we learn throughout our lifespan. How can we increase our sense of connection and our sense of well-being with what we're doing? So, Tim, it's really hard to sum up, but I guess each day is different for me. And I grew up partly living overseas. My parents were diplomats, so I went to an international school. And when I moved into education as a lateral shift from doing that programming work, I really started studying some of the interdisciplinary components of curriculum, and I wanted to work in an international environment. So I started out teaching in the US, and then I moved to Belgium first. I worked there as a curriculum development specialist and full-time teacher. And then I moved from Brussels to Zurich in Switzerland and lived there for 6 years and worked at the international school there, also doing curriculum work and programming. But throughout that process, I was really thinking about what it would mean to found my own company. So yeah, I would say I love to be a bridge for other people too, and enable that kind of learning with meaning underneath. And yeah, I could go on, but I'll kind of pause there to see if you have any questions based on what I've said so far.
Well, I like that idea of being a bridge. And I think, looking at your fascinating background, Caitlin, and all of the expertise and experience, you are a rare voice, I think, in education today because we hear a lot, at least in edu Twitter, where I spend a lot of my time. I see and hear a lot from educators who are advancing, of course, coding and STEM education. And there's a ton of thinking around the computational thinking skills and everything that goes with that and its place in education. But there are very few educators who really have spent time on the technical side, and you've really gone deep as a developer and programmer yourself. So you bring some really important perspectives to the conversation. And you're also stating the obvious here, you're also a female, which is, as I spoke to my guest a couple weeks ago, Julie Ross Kleinman from ISTE, that's still an ongoing concern, right? Is bringing up the number of females that are entering these fields. So I think you're really modeling all of the creativity and the interest that we want our girls, our female learners to have in this space. And everything you said about building communication and relationships through these tools, I think is so important as well, because sometimes we get this idea that in technology we lose relationships, but there are opportunities to foster them as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, underneath what I believe, and sometimes it's not even explicit. It's kind of embedded in what I'm doing. I really believe in this idea of non-binary, like we contain multitudes. That's a quote by Walt Whitman, and I feel like people are a multiplicity of stories. And for me to be somebody that loves technology, um, my grandfather, he worked with ultrasonics and he did the bonding on spacesuits. So his job was to make sure that the spacesuit was impenetrable to the atmosphere, and I felt like for me, he was one of my heroes growing up, and we'd go to his workplace and kind of tinker and learn. But the whole time I was dreaming about this idea of aeronautics and astronomy, and I feel like for me, I grew up also writing a lot of poetry and, being an artist creative. So as I got older, it was interesting because I noticed that people like to kind of separate science and art and say, oh, if you're an artist, you're a creative, and that would be something maybe not as sensible or rational as the science and math fields. And it's interesting to me because I feel like I get a lot of my ideas that have applications across tech, through some of the poetic insights and the cross curricular, some of the readings that I do. If I'm reading a poem, sometimes I think about it and I'm like, oh, that, this would be great to have as a VR experience. What can we put in there? And I ended up going back for my MFA and focusing on poetry. So, working with creative writing, I honestly feel like the body, the mind, we don't learn from the neck up. It's not just a brain in a container. I feel like our whole self is present in these learnings. So sometimes, even in the work I do, I feel like I'm experiencing it very intuitively and saying like, oh, there's some fusion here of art and science, and I think we're just starting to really peel back the layers on that after maybe the past couple decades in education have been a little overwhelming with the tools coming out and a lot of the apps, and it becomes like best tips and tricks. And I think as a teacher, I even felt kind of overwhelmed by that, and I kept remembering, like through mindfulness, that my calling had a sense of purpose. So I'd like to say that to anyone listening who's involved in education or in any kind of work where you feel sometimes overwhelmed by the noise and the chatter of these expectations that we be masters at a lot of different bells and whistles and apps, because I think deep down there's something inside of us that really wants to simply be and thrive and express. And there is a way, I think, that's it's growing and coming, and I think it's a force in community that can kind of encourage us to put our well-being first, and also stay creative and stay nurtured in the process.
Well, there's so much there, Caitlin, that I want to get into already, and, one of my biggest takeaways is the whole non-binary lens, and I think it's so easy for us as human beings and as educators to, sort of judge things around us through that binary lens, and I'm thinking in particular of, screens bad or screens good, and that overlooks the complexity and the nuance of, well, what is actually happening on those screens, right? And often there is more complexity going on. I also like your reference to our purpose, the deeper why. And as someone who enjoys technology and ed tech, that's a constant conversation that I think we need to have as educators. Is, well, what are we really aiming for? What is our purpose? And we're not just chasing the latest shiny object, right? We want to do what is best for our learners and for learning.
I feel like for me that was the challenge as a teacher when I discovered I could not only embody my purpose but make it more accessible to students. Then suddenly it wasn't a versus kind of situation. I really felt like my students understood some of my passions, my hobby projects, also why I felt called to teach. And the more I was open about that process, I felt like my purpose blended with a sense of presence where I was welcoming them into a space that we shared in the classroom, and it wasn't possession. I wasn't saying this is my space and your job is to learn material from me. It's a humbling experience because I feel like when I discovered more of my purpose, and this is the story is kind of at the beginning of Mindful by Design. When I wrote my book, I was thinking about how Parker Palmer wrote The Courage to Teach, and the courage means that we're human Mobius strips. Like our inner world connects with our outer world in teaching, and when students see that, they have this quality, I think, that lets us coexist in that space and we all become curious learners. And, I felt so much more engaged and less like I had to put on a suit of armor every day and go in and, it became so much more enriching for me. So that's kind of the purpose underneath writing the book, to teach other people about that journey and show some exercises across the curriculum that involve mindfulness, but also go into those curriculum areas. So we might talk about that later, but I feel like purpose was underneath the whole thing.
I really like what you're saying about sharing your world and your interests with your students. I teach eighth graders, and to some, I feel like there is this notion that you're really better off not to reveal any of your personal life to eighth graders, right? But with that in mind, I've sort of been a little bit tentative about mentioning this podcast and the work that I do here and some of the blogging and things outside of my classroom. But my experience, and maybe I just have a really nice group this year, my experience is that they really want to cheer me on. And the more that I share, a few of them have tuned into the podcast from time to time. So hello, if you're in my class right now. But
Hello.
but it is really fun because I think what I'm trying to do is model an activity of content creation and contribution to the world that I think is so important, because our eighth graders, our middle schoolers, are phenomenal consumers of content, but I'm always talking to them about what are you contributing back. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think when we reveal a little bit of ourselves, the real self, to our students, then it just enriches their experience, and it reminds them that we are human, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're kind of modeling that for them to follow too. So
Well, Caitlin, it's story time. So before we get much further into our conversation, I do want to talk about mindfulness and how that connects with your expertise in technology. Let's talk first about a low moment or an experience of adversity that you faced somewhere in your education journey, and describe how you overcame it.
first of all, the topic of failure is really awesome. That might sound kind of paradoxical, but I think so often we either couch failures as stories of success. We might only acknowledge a failure after we overcame it and we can kind of brand it and come to terms with it. But I think that there's something here to explore. I follow Brene Brown. I really believe in that power of vulnerability and courage. Um, And I recently saw Howard Rheingold. He's one of my education heroes. He's out here in California. Um, and we got together and he was talking. Howard's one of the people who developed online communication tools. And this was back in the 80s, even before the World Wide Web. He had, kind of a power of social collaboration. And he was talking with me about opening up to not knowing answers and having students lead the way. Yeah, and I think our failures as leaders can actually kind of elicit more of a foundation of community. Because if we look at a metaphor of science and like what is a most resilient system, it has to have different parts that need each other at different times, right? And if we don't open up about what we need, then others can't fill in with their strengths and we can't be diverse. So I guess I just, I had this feeling right now about failure um, as really being human, and also, isn't it kind of great that we're not great at everything? Like life is not a simulation, and sometimes I have trouble because I go in my mind, like mindfulness is my own practice because we all need it, and I say, oh, I could have done this differently, or what if I had known that? And it kind of teaches you to let go a little bit and say, okay, I can learn a lesson from that. But we can't always predict what's coming, and it's beautiful that we're not in control, again, that we can fail. And I just, what came to mind first was just this funny story. When I started teaching, I came into the world, like I said, from having more of a technical job background, and I was given a British literature classroom of juniors, and the curriculum chair said I could pick anything I wanted for the first outside reading. And I was really excited. I thought back to my time spent with classic literature and British, some of the classics. And my favorite book growing up, one of them when I was little, is a book called Mill on the Floss. And it's by George Eliot. And if you love literature, maybe you love this. Well, first of all, George Eliot is a woman. It's a little hard to teach to a class of juniors because the plot of Mill on the Floss is all about a brother and sister. So there's no real passionate love story. There's just a brother and sister, kind of like Mr. Robot, maybe. I don't know. But they're they're arguing with another family over rights to the river and rights to the power that the river provides. So this is their mill on the Floss, which is a British term for a river. There was so much deconstructing, Tim, that I needed to do to get the story across to the juniors. And they were saying, well, is there a love story? And no, not a love story. So it's not going to be like Jane Austen or anything like that. And I secretly wanted this book to be as popular for them. I don't know if you've ever taught something that's so close to your heart that you want to like sell it to your eighth graders and infuse all your passion. But this was one book where no matter how much I wanted it to work, I was even reading it again saying, this is dry. This is really dry, and everything needs context. And I had, I was new, so I had juniors coming down the hallway pointing at me saying "Mill on the Floss." It was kind of like this shame moment where I realized that not only was I new at teaching a book, like teaching how to learn and read something, but I had to shake up the language. I had to make it fun. I had to make it engaging. And I'm sure that, yeah, the first month of teaching it was like a label of failure over it, where I had to try to see some humor because it was one of my favorites growing up that was just immensely hard to teach. And I'm laughing thinking about it because, you can't imagine like 60 people in two separate classes carrying this book around as they're outside reading. Like, I can't stand this book. Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, how do you recover from that? I guess you turn it into knowledge that you meet learners at their level, and it's not always a level of interest or passion. Sometimes if you're taking a piece that was set in a different time period or a different language, you create links that give them some sense of ownership and authenticity. And sometimes you just laugh at your choices and say, even if this is close to my heart, it might not succeed at being close to everybody's.
Right. Yeah, that's sound advice. Great story. I'm thinking about my own context, lots of applications, and it is sometimes about reading the room. And it also connects with the idea of student voice and agency, right? And sometimes it does mean letting go of those, as you say, those passions that we hold so dearly as educators or as simply as fans of great literature and meeting our students where they are. I think that's great advice. Well, Caitlin, you've created an online course for educators on the topics of mindfulness, SEL, and teachers' well-being. And I thought this is so timely to get into as we finish off the holiday break and as teachers get into the second term of the year in most school districts around the world. You shared your passion for teacher wellness in an age of high teacher burnout, stress, and anxiety in the profession. So talk to us about the important mind shifts that we need to make as educators and education leaders as well to stay on fire with passion and avoid burning out.
Tim, I'm so glad you mentioned this because the statistics do show there's such a high rate right now of burnout, stress, anxiety, high rates of teachers dropping out of the profession, some teachers joining and not making it past the first 2 years. And I did develop an online course that's been taking Mindful by Design, the book, as almost a textbook and a practical resource. And then I work with teachers long distance so that people can study the practices on their own and then talk about the applications. Right now it's not only a trend, but it's something that's sometimes overlooked because I think that teachers get isolated. A lot of people who have talked with me about the uses of mindfulness and social emotional learning in the classroom, they say it's really important. And sometimes either administration at their school, they don't have enough resources, and a teacher's day in the classroom is spent always on attending to the students. So, as teachers, we're really good at doing our jobs well, which is putting students first, and being first responders. And what happens in the body, I learned this through taking a lot of mindfulness courses and classes on MBSR, which is mindfulness based stress reduction. What happens is basically, if there's any need, as humans, actually, we were created as creatures to react to anything that's happening pretty fast. So what happens is cortisol spikes if we have any situation of stress, and we can sometimes react short term, and that's great. But if we're experiencing stress for a long time and constantly being in that response mode, it can be very damaging, to our well-being, to our levels of stress, and actually to our physiological systems. So yeah, so just in sum, what was happening, the reason that mindfulness, I think, became such a buzzword is in the late 70s and 1980s, a bunch of medical researchers in the US, including John Kabat-Zinn, they started doing research on people who had been Vietnam War veterans and were experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they were saying, wow, this mindfulness practice, if we take it out of its ancient Buddhist context and make it something that is not religious, but a practice where we start noticing our breath and noticing our thoughts and acknowledging what's happening. Short term, there is a little bit of higher stress because you're acknowledging what's going on. But long term, that type of practice actually brought health and well-being back into these recovering patients. And through those studies, now you can follow Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin. There's a lot of medical studies happening that continue to document the physiological benefits of these practices. So mindfulness has some variations in the ways that you can apply it. And what I found when I started studying it, it was a combination for me of having the background in poetry and expression, and also wanting to study, well, what can we do to decrease stress on the part of teachers and on students who sometimes are taking tests and they feel like there's anxiety, there's high stakes. I wanted everyone coming into my classroom to feel like the number one thing is to belong and to feel safe and to feel like you can explore and that your voice matters. So, as a creative myself, I really wanted to greet a student and say, "Hi, welcome. Who are you? What's your story?" Uh, yeah, and I found, um, working with students, that blooming would start to happen, and other teachers would say to me, "Well, what are you doing? What's happening in your room that's bringing about these visible changes in students, that previously, I guess, had been having trouble with things like self-regulation, and experiencing joy." So for me, the development of methodologies and tools and exercises that became mindful by design were a process where I do incorporate some breathing techniques and some work where teachers can use those practices for their own well-being. What I realized along the way was that practicing mindfulness myself rubbed off on my students, even if I didn't say to them, "We're doing a mindfulness exercise." What happened is I was doing these practices for myself, and students would come in the room and just feel my sense of well being and calm. I had better capacity to greet them and meet their needs. And then I would say, "Okay, we're going to do a storytelling exercise where we work in some mindfulness practices included in that." I realized across the curriculum, you could start to build it in ways that overcame some of the challenges of teachers, which is usually, I don't have time, right? Like, we don't have time sometimes to take an 8-week program in mindfulness based stress reduction. But we might have time to do a little practice for ourselves that fits our personality, and we might have time to build it in a certain way into our curriculum. So that's what I've done and created, a first half of the book that's just for teachers and actually any adult. It could be somebody working in a different profession that wants to use mindfulness for themselves. And then the second half of the book is a way to, across the curriculum with those curriculum areas spelled out, a way to include the mindfulness practices in the curriculum exercises. And I've had people on marketing teams or people who work in different businesses saying, actually, this works really well for adults too, because who doesn't need to practice listening? And, who doesn't find it fun to sometimes have explorations into things like biomimicry? I feel like yeah. Anyway, the book has led to so many different ways to apply well-being, and I do think it's the future of how we learn. I think that education should be less siloed, and I think more businesses are saying, yeah, before we measured our well-being by GDP, like, what's going to happen in the future when we have this AI revolution, and suddenly it's like, okay, what is the human scale of how we measure well-being and what we want to fight for as a society?
So, Caitlin, I love what you're saying about mindfulness, and obviously, it sounds like there's a lot of good overlap between your course and the book. Something that you mentioned that really jumped out at me was this idea that in the short term, and this is kind of an epiphany for me, but it explains so much, and that is that in the short term, mindfulness can actually be a place of stress because it requires acknowledging the problems and the challenges that we're facing. It involves looking full in the face of these causes of anxiety. And I think that's why so many people, and I'll speak from my own perspective here, I think that's why sometimes we avoid mindfulness practices and journaling and spaces of meditation and reflection because maybe we don't really want to look full in the face of those causes of anxiety, right? But I like what you're saying that the more we stick with that over time, the better and you'll have the words better than I will, but we're just better equipped, right, to manage and respond to those problems and to address them in a reasonable, rational way instead of avoiding them until the last possible moment. So on that note, talk to us about some practical strategies. How can we improve our mindfulness and our emotional health, both as educators and as human beings?
Well, I think first off, what you say is really inspiring because I feel like we're all in this human experience, and in a way it's like back to befriending our own mind. And I think that we've become really good at occupying ourselves, like we have phone notifications and we have all these areas to explore, but sometimes it's the emptiness of leaving leaving space in between the notes to see what falls in. And I think that that's first of all, I'll hear a lot of people say either I'm a really bad meditator, which I laugh about because it's kind of, people say it's like the monkey mind. It always wants to go somewhere, and that's totally normal. Or they'll say something like, "I can't really clear my mind," and I think it's actually a misnomer that you're clearing your mind and just not thinking about anything. Um, with mindfulness, it's really something that is powerful when you find yourself letting your thoughts go and kind of just watching them pass by. One of the exercises for kids is to pretend that you're at a bus stop and you watch some of these thoughts that could be ruminations or problems, and they're buses, and you just decide if you're going to get on and ride the bus or if you're going to watch it, notice it, and say, you know what, I'm going to let that one go. I have another one I want to ride. And I think it works for us too as adults to think of it that way. And as much as mindfulness, we might focus on anxiety, there are also all of these amazing thoughts that will come in, and some are creative and wonderful. So I think there is that flip side where you're opening up to discovery too when you start to incorporate that wonder space. So just some quick practices that sometimes I will work with teachers or groups of people is just to remind to the simple things like secure our safety belt first, um, remembering what makes you get an internal lift, like what makes you come alive, and defending time for that, even if it's just a few minutes each day to go for a run or cook if you love cooking. These sound so simple, but that's part of mindfulness too, just remembering that not only do you deserve it, but it's part of what feeds your well and lets you do what you do really well. Um, I also tell myself that just 3 breaths, if I'm feeling a lot of stress, I can stop and just take 3 slow breaths. We could even do one right now where you kind of, just breathe in through your nose. And you feel the air coming in and filling your chest, and then feel that easy turn, and you just let your breath go out. As you breathe in again, just try to notice the way you're sitting in the chair. Try to hold your body with dignity. And as you exhale, just easily let it out. And with the third breath in, just try to acknowledge a good thought and keep that positive thought in your mind. And you exhale and just let anything go. When I exhale, I just think, let it go. And when I'm breathing in, I'm thinking, take in the good. And I can just do this in my mind. And 3 breaths is kind of like hitting the reset button. And sometimes if I'm waiting, like in a waiting room for a doctor's office or, some meeting where I find myself, just feeling nervous, and I go back to my breath. And the breath really is great at being our anchor if we can focus on it for 3 breaths in and out. Yeah. So for me, these types of exercises, they feel very simple, and that's great because it means we can keep them in mind and remember them, and they kind of just sand away all the rough edges. Gratitude exercises, I try once a day just to think of what and who I'm grateful for. Um, yeah, so again, it sounds very simple, but as a teacher, as someone in the world, the more I can encourage myself to keep these practices in my life in the midst of what might seem like a sarcastic, caustic culture. These are my values about keeping time and space for wonder and for noticing the details and for practicing that level of self care.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I feel like that was a gift right there. That I think my listeners are feeling better just after walking through those exercises and thinking about those steps with you. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I look forward already to hopefully sharing these out further on the different platforms where Teachers on Fire lives, because I think we've already covered a lot of this, but we all need a little bit more of the self-care and as you put it so well, that mindful lifestyle. Otherwise, things just pile up too quickly and we get into an unhealthy space. Well, you've talked about the mindfulness part. We've talked about emotional wellness and health. Let's talk a little bit more about cultivating aware, advancing, and authentic learning experiences. You've done all of this work in the AR and VR spaces. And of course, with AR and VR, we're talking about augmented and virtual reality. Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about some of your favorite applications of these technologies that you've seen in classrooms and schools and educational institutions lately. What is really exciting you about these technologies?
Oh my gosh. I feel like 2020 is a sea change, probably, in the ways that these technologies are going to be used and applied. Uh, I say that not just hopefully, because I am a user and consumer of a lot of different AR and VR applications. I feel like if we look at a school curriculum and the ways that we try to lift up discovery and democratization of experience, now it's about the how. I think we agree on the why, that we want students to be more owners of their learning, and across different landscapes, what AR and VR can do in a way that I haven't seen with other types of technologies is they can basically take you out of your own limits of your sensory experience and replace your field of vision and your inputs with other sensory inputs. So, I can't even, some of these words that people would use to articulate it are kind of like, imagine a layer of your brain being replaced with different sights and sounds and feelings. And what happens is really visceral. I mean, I've done workshops in VR where people who've never tried it before, they put on a headset and suddenly it's a confrontation with the self that feels very intimate. Like, you start having an experience and you can't describe it until you put on that headset, because your body says, I am here, in a way that you don't feel when you're, say, watching a story on a television. It's a different feeling of being able to look around in 360. And with AR, what you can have is a customization of what's happening in your environment, where um, things have context. You can look at something and hold up a screen, and then suddenly on it, details are illuminated and the environment starts to pop out. I think that you mentioned earlier this notion of the nuances of having meaning underneath what we're doing in the learning. And I think that, you know, before, it's been a lot of, this new technology came out and how do we use it, and this is confusing. And I think that right now what's happened is we are starting to have more people who can be mentors to others, who are starting to share how you use different tools, how you can come into different learning platforms and not feel so overwhelmed. Like, even using Twitter, you can put out your interests, and chances are there's somebody else out there who's already been exploring that and can help you. So for me, I'm excited about this because I think it's going to shake up teaching in a really big way. I think it'll be interesting to see how students are using storytelling and also getting to know each other in a new way. I think it's important, actually, to have mindfulness and social emotional learning as part of the context of how we build in immersive learning experiences, because for me, my experience has taught me that so often we focus on the experience itself of in VR or with AR, but the before and the after are actually when some deep learning happens because there's a preparation where you put what you're doing in context. And then afterwards, students start to share, oh, I heard this, I saw this, I learned this about a different culture. What does that mean? So I'm trying to build different experiences where I can help mentor teachers and help them learn about how to use these applications with less fear, and also how to set it up in a way that connects with what they're already doing in the classroom in an analog way.
I like the piece about mentorship, and I'm going to put an early plug for anyone listening interested in these areas. Make sure you give Caitlyn a follow. She's not just a fan, she is on the cutting edge. So it's just incredible to scroll your Twitter feed. And again, as I said at the outset of this conversation, I do feel out of my depth, but it is such an awesome and fascinating field. Well, before we move on from this space, I also want to talk about AI, Caitlyn. To me, I'm excited to see how AI is changing the game in literacy, and I've talked about the smart compose features moving into Google Docs and other areas of learning. I'm also interested to see how voice-to-device technology continues to slowly improve, and I'm hoping that in a decade or so, I'll be able to do virtually anything on my phone with just my voice. So, Caitlyn, as someone who has done some work in this area, how do you see AI also shaping learning experiences in the K-12 classroom?
I think that AI, when we say AI, sometimes sci-fi comes into our mind. We think about Ex Machina. I know this, and sometimes sci-fi is great. Like, I grew up reading Isaac Asimov. I love the idea of sci-fi storytelling. With artificial intelligence, I think, for me, I agree with you completely, Tim. If we could have more voice activated programs, that would be awesome. I think that AI is actually informing a lot of the applications in VR and AR that I was talking about earlier, like the ability to do what we do and operate with greater efficiency. John Carmack was at the Oculus Connect conference recently, and I was kind of gathered around him as he was talking with people. John Carmack was working at Oculus. He's still supporting there, and he's just amazing in the field. And if you like him, I just do a shout out for Joe Rogan's podcast, because he had John Carmack on recently for, I think, 2.5 hours this fall, talking about applications in VR. And also, I think he's now dedicated to kind of cracking some of the AI and artificial general intelligence, AGI. If you're interested, there's also a series that MIT has, their AGI series of lectures. They're really interesting if you're interested in things like emotional intelligence and how emotion tracking is affecting AI, and whether we can really do recognition of sentiments through people's faces. And I find all of this, again, really fascinating, because right now, just some snippets of takeaways. At the OC conference, John Carmack was saying that in the future, he thinks that the voice commands are going to be really powerful in VR, because you don't have to hold up controllers or your hand and toggle through options. You could just have a yes/no voice command where your eye tracking would show what you're looking at, and then your voice could say, something would pop up. Do you want to select this? And you just say yes or no, or zoom, toward or away. So some of this is directional, and he was thinking, this is going to make it so much more intuitive about the way that we operate inside a virtual field. And it could be, that our interactions are actually different in virtual reality than they would be in the real world, because sometimes if you think about what you can do in size and scale in VR, you could levitate, you could go all over the place, you could change your size and scale like Alice in Wonderland. So there's so many different ways to kind of shake up this notion that virtual reality is going to replicate the world with its constraints of what we live with. Some of the challenges with AI right now is that the systems are trained on data sets. So when you're an engineer working with AI, your programming is based on a data set that you gather. And right now it's hard to gather data sets with biological data because there are all kinds of privacy issues. But you're not having an accuracy if you don't have a really diverse data set. So, for example, with like facial recognition, you're not going to be very accurate judging different faces if you don't have different faces in your feed to train the data set. So, I have a quote like, "You're only as diverse as your data set," because it's been a real issue for different groups feeling like it's not an inclusive environment if that is not attended to in the early stages. So I personally think AI is a very ironically human field because we're trying to learn underneath the choices what the ethics are, and I'll just ask people, do you feel like your voice activated assistant is a human? Have we anthropomorphized the robot so much that I personally feel like it's very good to be considerate of our robot friends. I don't find myself, I would kind of bristle if somebody was yelling at Alexa or anything like that, and I kind of laugh. You know what I mean? Like people, it it's just funny.
Well, it's
Yeah.
so funny that we're having this conversation because my wife and I have sort of an ongoing joke about how she hates that I listen to my girlfriend Siri, and when we're trying to get somewhere, I want Siri to tell me how to get there, and she wants me to just shut that thing off, and she'll tell me how to get
Yeah. Yeah.
so we have that ongoing joke. But more seriously, it's so interesting that you talk about the data sets and how these companies need to. And again, I'm constantly humbled here at every turn because I'm out of my depth. But my understanding is these companies like Apple and Amazon's Alexa, they need to build more robust data sets to make the AI more intelligent. Am I on the right track there?
No, you're definitely on the right track there because these data sets are learning, and as the engineers they can feed in more diversity into them, but the question is, where are they sourcing them from? Are they sourced from something that is human powered, or are they making up the data set as they go? And I think that part of this, again, is the black box of AI and how it operates. And sometimes there's a lot of testing that's needed upfront to just see what happens when different inputs are put in. So you're right on target with the way that you're thinking about things. And I would say the best thing to tell people is if you're interested in this, it is something fascinating right now, and you can follow different podcasts, you can follow lectures, learn more. And I think that, again, the AI field should not be so isolated. It should be something where teachers get involved, people get involved, and we're curious and not just operating out of fear, imagining those sci-fi stories that we grew up with. Because right now is a really human time to get involved and talk about how we want to shape our interactions in the future. Um, AI is replacing everything that could be an automated process. So that's really where right now its sweet spot is. And the part that they can't exactly figure out is how to replicate something like a human brain. And that's really fascinating to me. That's artificial general intelligence. Like, where does consciousness lie? And what's happening with the ideas of creative impulse? You can have an AI robot create a piece of poetry or a song, but does it have a soul?
Right. And the magic behind self-awareness and of course, yeah, as a person of faith myself, I have views about the sacredness of the human being that is something that will never be replicated in machines. But coming back to the AI and the data sets, it was interesting. I just upgraded the iOS version on my phone to, I think it was version 13.3, and I did that this morning, and I got a prompt from my Apple device saying that Siri wishes to, and I'm not going to get this perfectly, but Siri wishes to collect and save certain selections of recordings or, things that it takes from my, I guess my conversations with Siri, or others might say, and you might you might tell me that Siri is listening all of the time. I suppose it is, right? If I say, "Hey Siri," right now, oh, my phone's not responding. But anyway, the the idea being that our these companies do need to gather more inputs, and so we have that tension. And I know we could have a whole other podcast show just about the tensions between privacy and the sharing or the big data economy. But we do have these applications that need to collect more information, and for the most part, I tend to look at that as progressive, as innovative, as innocuous. But then a quick scan of the headlines shows that there has been some controversy in terms of third-party contractors listening into confidential conversations. So I don't even know if we want to touch that one, but it's definitely, we can acknowledge that it's definitely an issue that we want to be aware of and thinking about, right?
Well, and let's say, I think for me, the interesting part is Siri's Siri's trained to meet your needs. So as you're saying that, her training is basically giving you what she thinks you would expect or want. So if she's listening all the time, taking your inputs, and then essentially profiling you, there is an issue with maybe um, your data being compromised. I see it as a creative invitation too for us to think greatly about. I'm just imagining an inverted pyramid where if Siri's only taking the things that she expects that I like, she's never going to feed me something that is out of my comfort zone. So it's not really adding to any of my maybe rigor or something that would be new. And I used to love sometimes just that element of surprise when sometimes you'd stumble across something that nobody could predict would appeal to you, but sometimes it like fills your quirky need for something. So I don't know if the algorithm builds that in, but for me that would be a big loss if in the future all of our interests and needs were watered down to something that was an external algorithm expectation. You see what I mean? It would become narrower and narrower because it would be steering me with almost bumpers at the edges of what it thought I wanted to see. So, my fear is people would be siloed, data would be siloed. Yeah.
And I was just going to use that word silo because we talk about that in the social media spaces and even in Google search results, that in general, yes, we do want results that speak to our interests and our expressed passions. But on the other hand, we do need those external voices. We need the silo to be broken, right? Just so to make sure that we are continually growing and we're exposed to different perspectives. So yeah, I'm right with you. I hope as this AI continues to evolve and transform our lives and shape our existence, hopefully we'll never lose that. In fact, hopefully it will contribute to the expansion of diversity of voices and influences.
They say the brain learns the best when it has the element of surprise. So, how much can we be surprised, let ourselves see changes? It really is how we learn. When we like to look for patterns, but our brain actually learns best when we break patterns.
Oh, so rich and such a great connection, of course, with the way that we teach. Well, Caitlin, and you know what? One final note, one quick. I am one of these terrible people, constantly tempted to touch my phone, even though it's removed from me while I'm driving. I have it set up on my dashboard. It's so tempting to switch over to the next podcast or do whatever it is. So if Siri can get to the place where it's all entirely voice activated, I will be forever grateful. So Apple engineers, please get to work on that.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, Caitlin, what a fascinating conversation. I could go on at length, but I do want to touch on a couple of other areas as well before I let you go today. So as you look across your professional learning network and your own professional practice, what else is setting you on fire about education today? What really gets you excited about the future?
We've talked about so much of it, and I think for me this metaphor of being on fire is really apt because I think we spread it. We carry it like a flame ourselves, and we can easily pass it to somebody else and let them build that fire, make it their own. I love the metaphor. To me, having just talked with you about AI, this possibility of robot meeting human, and keeping the humanity first in terms of the impact of how we approach the future. I really have a hopeful view about how voice and creativity and storytelling are underneath everything that we're doing. And we didn't talk in detail about storytelling, but I think we talked about voice. And as humans, I think we've been telling stories since cave times. And, our fire essentially is what we find meaningful. And if that's a story, we pass it along to somebody else and say, I care about this, inherit this, and make it your own. So a lot of times, if we talk about, telling a good story or being on stage or being in the classroom, we're not really the hero. We're telling a story as the mentor, and then inviting the person who's the listener to find a meaning and be the hero in their hero's journey, and kind of live out that life of pushing boundaries and going into spaces that are the unknown, and then coming back into the ordinary world to tell the tale. And sometimes I think that's why I went overseas and kind of ventured out of my comfort zone so that I could, have some adventures like the Odyssey, and then come back home and tell the tale and pass it on to others. Um, so I will say that it makes me really excited to be in worlds where not only can we lift each other up, but we get to stay curious, stay connected, and remind ourselves that, we're very human. And this opportunity right now to create something that is love over fear really keeps me going.
Beautiful stuff. And that resonates so well with just this medium of podcasting. And it's one reason that I love to start the conversations that I do with the stories of adversity, because they are so universal. And I love everything you said there. And by the way, Caitlyn, I think you may have just given me some good future book title ideas. So thank you for that.
Sure.
that idea of the fire spreading, I think is so apt, as you put it.
Yeah. Well, tell me when we'll have a part two conversation. I love that.
Well, Caitlin, tell us about looking ahead to this new year of 2020. Tell us about how you are hoping to take the next step professionally and grow and learn. Just talking to you already, I know you've got some targets in mind. Can you share about a specific goal or a project that you are currently working on?
Sure. I'll share, I think, two big ones. One is the fact that this book, Mindful by Design, came out in 2019. So that was publication year. And I feel like 2020 is the year for the ideas to spread, more mentoring to happen. I'm doing work in different programs. And if people are interested in hearing more, they can get in touch with me. But there's so many different ways that this book has ideas that can become personalized and be involved in both classroom work and also teachers' well-being. So through mindfulness, through social emotional learning, there are a lot of practical applications that I'm working in across leadership systems, school systems, and really what I love about the work that I'm doing now is that some of it can be in person and some of it is through online tools where people who might not have time to attend a workshop in person or be at all of these conferences that we go to, they can still have the support on a very personal level. So I'm putting up a lot of news about that on my website, and it's all about well-being. And the second project is bringing more social emotional learning and mindfulness experiences into immersive learning worlds. So there are programs in the fall that we've been piloting through a shared platform called Engage. And in the Engage platform, anybody with a headset can come in from around the world and have an introduction to what mindfulness is and also learn more about how to use VR tools. And there are some AR applications that I'm also working on that have part of that skill set as the base, and then taking that and kind of leveling up and saying, well, how can I use it with applied technology and make sure that the community feels supported and cared about? And it's been great. I've had teachers get involved, and then they can spread that to their student groups and to their classrooms. So we just had a session this past Saturday with about 15 teachers from around the world. And that was amazing to just see everybody come in different times. It was the solstice day. So in certain parts of the world, that's the darkest day of the year when it turns to kind of lightning. And we were just talking about mindfulness and the senses and doing some exercises together in VR. And that was pretty amazing. So yeah, so those are two projects that are growing more in 2020, and I feel like they're kind of magnets pulling me forward where I feel like there's so much to look forward to.
Amazing, amazing stuff. You've got me thinking about the mindfulness, some of the breathing exercises and the other applications that you walk participants through, all through VR. It's just, my mind is blown right now. But let's let's move on. Outside of the spaces we've been talking about, Caitlyn, I love to pull back the curtains on just who you are as a human being. So tell us about some other special areas of learning and passion for you. What is it that really brings you alive as a human being when you leave these spaces that we've been talking about?
I love all sorts of arts. I'm a very human, curious learner. So for me personally, anything that involves photography really excites me. I had a camera when I was very little and just loved carrying it around and taking pictures. And now it's also a mindfulness tool. I find myself not taking a lot of pictures, but it reminds me to focus on the frame of something or the quality of light on a surface. So I find photography is a fun tool. I also love running and being outside in natural environments. My favorite place to run would be a trail. So if I can get off pavement, off road, I love those trails that kind of wind through woods. And I know in your area, I can picture you outside Vancouver having mountains and water. And for me, all those elements, when you start to combine them after, maybe 5 minutes of running, I start to get in this zone where I find time kind of stands still and I'm just kind of one body and breath just moving in nature. So for me, I love things like that. Uh, I've always loved travel, being surrounded by the music of other languages and other personalities, and also just some of the wonders that are around the world that you confront and you don't expect. Yeah, so that's part of what I love. I also love chocolate. Um, I just find it's nice to explore, especially with the ways that different places produce chocolate and flavors and fillings. So I keep playing around with the idea that someday I might write a book about chocolate and either make it a book of different stories that all relate back to chocolate or something that just gives me an excuse to do research. I have no idea, but I'll get back to you.
Yeah, you're not fooling around with that. So, and it strikes me too that as someone who's spent considerable time in Europe, you've experienced the real chocolate, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
you
I
be
picked Belgium, and then Switzerland. This was not an accident. I was just
yeah.
choosing chocolate countries. Yeah.
Caitlin, share about one personal habit or productivity hack that contributes to your success. How do you get it all done?
One productivity hack, for anyone who practices things like push-ups is I don't count the whole way. I just count up halfway and then down, because I find if I have to do, or if I tell myself I'm going to do 20 push-ups, 20 seems overwhelming, but 10 up and 10 down, I don't stop then. So that's just a trick for anyone who does weightlifting or something where you have to count. Personally, I don't really believe in resolutions of deprivation. So if there's any kind of New Year's resolution that's telling me to stop or don't, I try to frame it as a positive instead. And I think that's partly ideas that have to do with framing things in a positive light, like bring on the good. Uh, and I do believe in part of the research that I've been doing is all about growth mindset and that possibility of change. And I think that being productive also means realizing that we are not our own enemy. So I think that in the process of whatever you're doing to be productive, I would just tell people not only to be kind and gentle with yourself, but also if you could get it in a frame of trying to make it a game, like if you can gamify your productivity, I think it makes the process much more fun because sometimes we, like if we're doing something like cleaning, for example, it would be really hard maybe to find the process rewarding. But if we could make it a game, or if we could play some fun music while we're doing it, it becomes less of a chore that feels like you only get a sense of reward at the end when exhausted you let out a big sigh. You know what I mean? I'm the queen of trying to get myself in a mindset to embrace the possibility of both change and productivity, and also knowing that we're human along the way, and our bodies love to play and to make things games. So I guess that's what first comes to my mind. And if anyone wants to talk about that more, I know I'm always curious to hear about how people time manage, time track, um, become more productive themselves. It's one of my curious arenas.
Great stuff. Now, before we move on, have you got, you just mentioned you're always interested in hearing about other people's applications of this. Have you got a great app that gamifies some of your personal habits and goals, or how do you manage that?
I don't have an app. Like, I'm curious about this. My friend Dory Clark, she's been tracking her time and doing a lot of time management tracking. And I recently saw a TED talk that was given by a woman who creates art installations that represent how she spends her time. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't have an app that really manages that productivity, but I'm interested in that because sometimes I think with mindfulness, I tell myself it's great sometimes to let go and to just be in the moment. And um, I find there's always this duality of how do we do that, and how do we also attend to what's needed, and be both reachable and responsive. So I think there's a balance, and you're giving me a great idea that maybe on my blog or my website for 2020 I can keep kind of a list of places and spaces that are really helpful in that balancing of keeping productive. With that name, though, I would say that I'd shout out to a book by Lisa Johnson that's called Creatively Productive. I have it right next to me. How to succeed. I think that sometimes productivity sounds very machine-like, and we start to think, oh, it's about denial and putting everything into an Excel spreadsheet and behaving like a robot. And part of what knowing Lisa has encouraged and reinforced is that we can be creative, and exercise a lot of freedom, and also feel like we get things done and we're responsive along the way.
That is so funny that you mentioned that, because I am that guy who has put his daily personal habits in an Excel spreadsheet or
Oh,
or
wow.
actually
Nothing
Goo
against it.
Google Sheets in my
Yeah,
case. No, but that conversation with Lisa Johnson was really, really fascinating, because Lisa, is that tech person and a big fan of it, a curious learner, but she loves her paper passion planners as well. And so that was really interesting to see and listen to the hybrid system that she's using. So it sounds like the two of you are on the same page there.
absolutely. And also, what if our data just led us to some discovery about ourselves that we didn't know? I think that's part of the joy of this. Like, suddenly, as we start to track things, or, have an Excel spreadsheet, we would see, oh, I actually spent an hour doing that. Do I really want to dedicate my time to that? Or could I repurpose it somewhere else? I think it's really interesting.
So good. Well, it is time for your quick picks, Caitlin. And here we want to know the education voices and resources that are shaping your practice and inspiring your thinking today. So, starting at Twitter, tell us about someone we should follow there and share why they've been inspiring you lately.
Okay, I like Kent Bai. He is generous, insightful. Kent Bai has a podcast called Voices of VR, and if you're curious about VR, what I like about Kent is he teaches others he works across different fields, and he's very philosophical, but also clear. So if he's attending some kind of conference or talk, you'll find his stream with like his top takeaways. And following him on Twitter just kind of leads me to new discoveries all the time. The second person I would recommend is someone I have just discovered. And I think this is really interesting because sometimes we promote other people and you look on Twitter and they have tons of followers already. And this person is pretty new to Twitter, Alexandra Piri. She's NH Poet Laureate. I met her recently, and she infuses mindfulness into poetry and is the Poet Laureate of New Hampshire. And part of her experience and what she's teaching is helping people overcome writer's block. So, if you're curious about anything about expression and you've ever had an experience with writer's block, or some feeling of having something to say but not being able to get it across to others, just this was a curious moment when I thought, wow, really fascinating. And it's been wonderful to discover Alexandra Piri.
Point us to an ed tech tool that you currently love using somewhere in your practice.
I've mentioned Engage. It comes to mind right now because it's a social platform for people who are all over the world to learn in VR. And I think for me, that's an ed tech tool that I'm discovering that I really love. I'm also exploring 3D Bear. That's an AR tool, but now moving into more of an immersive learning, including VR. And just being able to use some of these ed tech tools for social emotional learning and applications that are really human based. That's what really fires me lately.
Recommend one book, maybe one that you've been reading lately or one of your all-time faves, but a title that's been deeply influential.
There is Tommy Orange. I'm reading it right now, and I'm in the last quarter of the book. It has to do with Native communities around where I'm living right now in Oakland coming together for a powwow, and different voices are in this book. I love it. I discovered it through a friend recommending it, and the voices that he's written from their perspectives, they're all telling about Native American stories, histories, and kind of changing the context and opinion about the histories of what happens when people and their families leave reservations and are living in cities. This all takes place around Oakland, and I find it's just really mind-blowing. I'm learning so much. And the second book is CJ Casciata's Get Weird. His book is called Get Weird, Discover the Surprising Secret to Making a Difference. And I met CJ this fall at an education conference, and I've been reading this book, and it has pieces of Jim Henson and stories of creatives throughout the ages. And I think sometimes when we have a certain quirkiness, this book just reinforces the need to bring that out and kind of feed it forward into the world. And I love the way that CJ writes stories.
Tell us about a podcast that you've been really enjoying lately and maybe make the case for us to subscribe.
I like Radiolab. I like This American Life. And I like Following the Moth and Moth Stories. So I would just say, those are kind of big names. I like this podcast as well. I think that for people who are curious about podcasts, they can be really great because you can listen to them while you're on a walk or in the car. It's amazing to start discovering the little human stories underneath. And I especially like the ones that involve some kind of science.
And then a couple more questions, both about video. Tell us about a YouTube channel that you enjoy.
Well, I just created my own, so I find it's interesting as a YouTube creator. I'm starting to put up more videos about VR, so it's kind of a shout out to myself. It's teaching me a lot. That's why I'm saying this, because on my channel, I'm going to have links to places that I love and that I love to learn from. I find before I got into creating videos on YouTube, I had a different feeling about them. And now, as someone who's producing them, I find it can be a great way to share best tips, tools. As soon as you start to produce things that you find valuable, a whole community kind of springs up.
Absolutely. That's a space that I'm looking forward to getting into a little bit more in 2020 as well. And then, just for fun, Caitlin, strictly non educational here. What are you watching on Netflix these days?
I just watched the series finale of Mr. Robot, so I think I was mentioning Elliot and Darlene earlier, so I find that's just in my heart right now. I've loved Mr. Robot from the beginning stages, and it's been great seeing it. Yeah, it's an unbelievable show, and I uh, I love movies. I have a press pass, and I cover film festivals for fun. I actually got to see the cast of Mr. Robot when they came to Zurich about 3 or 4 years ago, and I feel like this show is kind of about being on the outside, but also wanting to be a force for good in society. So it's been interesting to watch the evolution of the plot, and also The Good Place. I like watching that. It has ethics and all kinds of questions that bring about what is reality. So I find that these types of shows. I also watch The Watchmen. They kind of bring up a lot of questions that we can think about ourselves too and make personal.
That's right. Do you watch Black Mirror?
I have watched episodes of Black Mirror. What I love about Black Mirror is you can take each episode as an individual entity, and you
Yes.
don't have to be hooked on the plot of, you can kind of watch it whenever you have a chance to. And I will say there was a period of time where I was watching nothing but Black Mirror, and it was a little dark. I love it. I love it, and I try to tell myself like Black Mirror is the warning of sometimes what not to do, or how to shape society in a different way, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's a great list. Thank you, Caitlin. Now, normally I sign off here, but you did mention to me earlier that you're a big poetry fan. Would you care to share some of your favorite works here? Maybe let us in on what's been touching your heart or capturing your imagination recently.
I would love that. I know I'm grateful for the time here with you, Tim, and I feel poetry, first off, it's a personal passion of mine. I also think that poetry is the type of thing where maybe people don't flock to bookstores saying, I must have poetry. But I feel like when it's missing, we notice it. It's like poetry is what we seek out when we're celebrating a happy moment. Poetry tends to distill down emotions. And when I was teaching, I would use poetry a lot in exercises just to say, you can look at the sound of a poem, you can look at the structure, you can talk about symbolism. And a lot of the work that I'm doing has poetry as a thread underneath everything. So um, I brought some poems with me, and I thought if we were going to have time for it to be included, I wanted to just read a very few. I highlighted some that I just felt I wanted to share with people as a closing here, because I think um, again, poetry can be uniting, and sometimes it's something that we fall into that might just be relaxing and rewarding in itself.
I love it. And we're breaking new ground here on this episode, Caitlin, which is awesome. So while you get set up here, I'm going to tell my listeners just take a deep breath, or maybe three deep breaths, right? And center yourself and enjoy.
All right, thank you. So I've selected three pieces of poetry that I'd like to read today to you. And actually, let's make it four, because there's one that's just a bonus. So hang in there for four pieces of poetry that will encourage us to greet 2020 with hope, with courage, and with joy. Two kinds of intelligence. There are two kinds of intelligence: one acquired, as a child in school memorizes facts and concepts from books and from what the teacher says, collecting information from the traditional sciences as well as from the new sciences. With such intelligence, you rise in the world. You get ranked ahead or behind others in regard to your competence in retaining information. You stroll with this intelligence in and out of fields of knowledge. getting always more marks on your preserving tablets. There is another kind of tablet, one already completed and preserved inside you. A spring overflowing its springbox, a freshness in the center of the chest. This other intelligence does not turn yellow or stagnate. It's fluid, and it doesn't move from outside to inside through conduits of plumbing learning. This second knowing is a fountainhead from within you moving out. Rumi. Beating time. Commemorating the removal of poetry as a requirement in Arizona's schools, August 1997. The governor interdicted, "Poetry is evicted from our curricula, for metaphor and rhyme take time from science. Our children's self-reliance rests upon the things we count on. The laws of engineering. Poeteering squanders time, and time is money." He said, "Let the chips fall where they may." The governor's voice fell down through quicksilver microchip song, hummed along, and the law was delivered to its hearing, and the students of engineering bent to their numbers in silent classrooms, where the fans overhead whispered, I am, in iambic pentameter. Unruly and fractious numbers were discarded at the bell. In the crumpled cast-off equations, small black figures shaped like tadpoles formed a nation, unobserved, in the wastepaper basket. Outside, a storm is about to crack the sky. Lightning will score the dry riverbeds, peeling back the mud like a plow, bellowing, taking out bridges completely unexpectedly. The children too young to have heard of poetry's demise turn their eyes to the windows to see what they can count on. They will rise and dance to the iamb of the fans, whispering illicit rhymes, watching the sky for a sign while the rain beats time. Barbara Kingsolver. Love after love. The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. Derek Walcott. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Mary Oliver. I share these poems with our group here, and I've shared a lot of these with students because they speak about the truths that are sometimes underneath, and they unite us. So I see poetry as part of that fire that sustains us. It's human, and I feed from it, and I give it as a gift also to people who hear it, just to know that we all belong with this range of emotions and feelings and experiences. And I think teaching is that beautiful world where you get to experience so much and give it to others and share it.
Beautiful stuff, Caitlyn. Thank you so much for another just incredible gift. And I so appreciate your thoughtfulness and just hearing from your heart today. For those interested in everything that you bring to the table, and it is such a fascinating spectrum here, we've heard all the way from AR and AI to poetry and creativity and the human spirit, and of course, mindfulness at the very center of it all. What are the best ways for the listeners to connect with you and learn more?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here on this podcast together and share time. There's nothing like the gift of live time together. And for any listeners who want to keep in touch with me, I would say the heart is my website, CaitlynKrause.com. There is a form there where people can join, subscribe, and that way I can keep in touch with people. I like to put up all the latest research and things that I find out about on that website. And also there are some creative spaces. So if I'm giving a talk or workshop, people can find out on the website. They can also follow me on Twitter. And there are other links that I know are going to be in the space below, probably our podcast. But again, there are many ways to keep in touch. I would say people should know that they shouldn't hesitate to reach out personally. My email is also on the website. So if they have questions or if they want to get involved in a project in some way, it's a pleasure for me.
That all sounds good, Caitlyn. Again, I want to thank you so much, as you said, for sharing your time with the podcast audience today. And I have to say personally, what a joy this conversation has been. It's spoken to my heart and my mind in so many different ways, and I'm so thankful to make this connection.
I echo that back. I'm smiling ear to ear. Yeah, absolutely.
So take care. Have a wonderful 2020. I won't wish you well on your 2020 goals because I took note of what you said there, but I wish you well in all of your future endeavors, and let's talk again soon.
Thank you. Likewise. Cheers, Tim. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for listening.
Before we sign off today, I'd like to share some highlights from around the Teachers on Fire community this week. First stop is on Twitter, where Kevin O'Shea at Mad for Maple tweeted, "Out for my nightly walk. I usually listen to podcasts when walking. What am I listening to tonight? At Teachers on Fire," end quote. And of course, the screenshot showed that he was tuned into episode 115 with Jonathan Alzheimer. So thank you for that, Kevin. I hope Jonathan inspired some hashtag next level teaching in your classroom this week. Next up, I want to say hello to followers of Teachers on Fire over on Instagram. I recently posted a quote from at James_Clear. He's the author of Atomic Habits. And I added a caption that read, "I'm definitely a goal setter and I've seen big results in my life over the last 5 years that I credit to setting specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timeline goals at the start of the year. Still, as James Clear reminds us, the power of achievement comes from our systems, those things we do with great consistency. Small sacrifices over time produce great results. Here's to solid systems in 2020. And to that, Jane Silversides, one of my original interviewees here on Teachers on Fire, and you can find her on Twitter at jsilversides, commented, that is amazing advice. 5 exclamation marks to follow. Thank you for that, Jane. I definitely appreciate the follow there on Instagram. Over on Facebook, in response to my Best 9 post of 2019, Anik Roke wrote, "Love, love, love, Tim. Thanks for amplifying so many voices. Grateful to learn alongside you, and meeting you IRL was pretty awesome too." And of course, Anik is referencing her visit to the Vancouver area in the summer of 2019. It was great to take our families for a walk and do some hiking and swimming together. So I appreciate that, Anik. That's definitely a highlight for me as well. Well, to all who have read, viewed, liked, retweeted, commented, or replied to my content on these platforms or any other where Teachers on Fire can be found, thank you. You are the fuel to my fire, and I so appreciate your support. I also want to invite you to check out the Teachers on Fire magazine on Medium, and I've set some ambitious goals there this year. I'm committed to getting back to one education post a week, so I hope to be a regular myself. But in the last 7 days, that didn't happen for me. I was busy vacationing with my beautiful wife in New York City. And meantime, Debbie Tannenbaum fired off 4 pieces on the magazine. So here they are. And you'll find Debbie on Twitter at Mrs. Tannenb. She wrote one called New Year, New Challenges, where she referenced blog posts by Mandy Freilich, George Krause, and Dave Burgess about the importance of self-care and connected their ideas with her one word for 2020. She also published Are You Ready to Go Rogue? A review of the 4 O'Clock Faculty, a rogue guide to revolutionizing professional development by Rick Ches at RACZYZ on Twitter. She wrote a third piece called Rediscovering an Old Friend, Journaling. And finally, she wrote hashtag one word 2020 challenge, where she talks about the reasons why challenge will be her word for the year and what that will mean in terms of application and changes in her life. I believe 4 posts from Debbie is a new record for the magazine, so great stuff, Debbie. Keep it up. Also on the magazine, Lynn Thomas at TomLynn101 continued her journey through the alphabet with S is for System, a piece where Lynn suggests that more important than our goals are the systems we follow that actually produce the results we are looking for. Definitely an interesting perspective. I'm a big goal setter myself, but I definitely subscribe to that theory as well. I think it's a combination of both, that our systems, our habits are really what it comes down to. Do we have those routines in place that will deliver the results that we are looking for? Well, the Teachers on Fire magazine is a Medium publication, and you'll find it on medium.com or on the Medium app. If you're already an education blogger, consider joining our growing writing team there. You can continue to publish content on your own blog, and you keep full credit and ownership of your content on Medium. And as I've written on Twitter recently, Medium does compensate writers based on engagement and read time. I've earned as much as $192 for a single post. Message me at Teachers on Fire on any social media platform for more details. Well, I will leave you with this quote from my reading Teachers on Fire. It's from a book called Hacking Assessment, and it's written by Star Sackstein, and you can find her on Twitter at MSSACKSTEIN. And the quote reads, "As we rid ourselves of the grades, risk-taking and questioning became a natural part of the process." Again, as we rid ourselves of the grades, risk-taking and questioning became a natural part of the process. And of course, she's making the point there that inside of a traditional grading assessment environment, one of the things that we see is that students are less likely to take chances, to take risks, to think outside of the box, but moving to a standards-based grading system certainly encourages all of those traits, and that's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of gradeless assessment. Again, I'm your host, Tim Cavey, and I'm so grateful that you decided to spend some of your day listening to this podcast. I hope that in some way the content you heard today from Caitlyn Krause ignited your thinking and inspired your practice. And I'll meet you next week right here on the Teachers on Fire podcast. Take care and have a great week.